We've had a lot of different kinds of people on Pushback Talks over the years. Artists, journalists, academics, lawyers, politicians, and protesters. Despite their different areas of work, you may have noticed a few common threads as we move across subjects and around the world. Things like what it takes to build a movement, or the need for better regulation in areas that are an absolute necessity, like food, water, and housing. Or even the massive role of the media in shaping how we understand the world, like Vincent Bevan spoke about just last episode. This week we speak to Dr. Ricardo Tranjan, a political economist and author, who pulls together common threads from the world we live in to show us that the system is functioning exactly how it is intended to. His book, The Tenant Class, asserts that tenants are not just homeowners in waiting, and holds landlords and governments responsible for the current system that sees massive profits being reaped as people are put out on the street. Let's listen to his conversation with the filmmaker and the advocate as they cover a few more common threads, like the power of collective action and courage in the face of insurmountable odds.
I'm Fredrik and I'm the filmmaker.
And I'm Leilani Farha, and I'm the advocate.
And we are back again with Pushback Talks, which is kind of nice. I'm back in Malmö and you are in your basement in Ottawa. And I actually saw a very bleak sun in the mist, but it took 30 seconds and it went away, so it wasn't too much, but still there is some hope. That's like my little observation of weather. And I heard that you can't ski anymore by the river.
Too warm. It's too warm. Climate change has hit Ottawa, the nation's capital. It's too warm. We can't skate. We can't ski. We just shuffle around on the ice.
But give it a few more months and you will see some spring flowers. Like
I hope so.
2 months, 2.5.
Yeah. 4.
Sorry, bad joke. Today we're going to stay in Canada because, we premiered Push, and Push also partly covered Canada. And today we're inviting a writer who's also based in Ottawa, who wrote a book called The Tenant Class. And when we read this book, we find out that it lands almost in the same points as Push. So welcome to our podcast, Ricardo Tranjan. And that's cool that we're not lonely with this analysis.
Hello, everybody, and thanks for having me here today. I agree, the book does land on some of the same dynamics than the movie, and I think it's because both try to politicize the housing question, try to move away from this notion that there's an invisible hand on the one hand, and on the other side, there's like individuals struggling to get by, and we give more context on both sides. There is actually some concerted actions for those pushing people out and for those also trying to stay in their homes. They're both acting collectively. So I think there's a one really nice and common thread there.
You don't even like the expression housing crisis. Why do you think that housing crisis is the wrong way to describe it?
Well, I think it's misleading. When we talk about a crisis, I think we tend to think about something that was unexpected or something that is impacting everyone negatively. And most importantly, we tend to think about something that everyone is trying to solve. And I think none of those things apply to housing. We have a system that works really well for some and that treats others as disposable. And it reproduces itself in that way. And when I say we don't have a crisis, I in no way mean to belittle the very concrete hardship that so many are experiencing. But I think when we're talking that way, it's not very helpful to get to the bottom of the problem.
So Leilani, sounds like a man of your liking.
I love this point that Ricardo explains probably better than anyone. The idea that the system is functioning exactly as it was intended. And in the tenant class, he really exposes that. Really, to me, even to me, you know me, I mean, I'm reading all the time. I'm really engaged in this. But even to me, it opened my eyes wider and made me realize, right, the system is functioning exactly as it is intended to. And what you just said, Ricardo, is so powerful, right? This idea, and I mean, we're right in the thick of it in world politics too, the idea that some people are disposable. That's what you just said. And in this case, we're talking about tenants. They're just a means to an end, and the end has nothing to do with them. It has to do with what they can produce for someone else, profits. Really, just so powerful. Tenant Class. Everyone here. There's my shout out to our listeners. Everyone, grab a copy of the Tenant Class, or I don't know, e-reader stuff. Download it. It's brilliant.
You can take over, Ricardo. I mean, you see, you and Leilani are playing, advocating the same thing.
I think we do, because one of the reasons for writing the book was that I was perplexed by how much we talk about housing. In Canada, it has become, second only to the weather as a small topic, right? We talk about all the time. There's so much media coverage on it. And yet the conversation is so superficial and it's so apolitical. And that has to do a lot with the media coverage that we get. We get this simplified supply and demand tired story every single day in our newspaper saying we didn't build enough housing, that's why prices are going up. Only if governments were to give developers a little bit more incentives and remove more red tape, then we'd build more houses and everyone would be happy ever after. And then at the individual level, everyone is just kind of like fending for themselves and sharing their own strategies to get in and buy their house and, and have that piece of land that will protect them from, speculations and from the market. And we don't have the more tough conversations about, well, there's some people making a lot of money here. One of the things that I do in the book, I go through a lot of the staff reports and government strategies that talk about affordability, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds of times. And the entire report doesn't mention profit a single time. So how can we talk about affordability and say something is too costly and not mention the obvious fact that if something is too costly, someone is walking away with bags full of cash. So I think it's a work that we're both doing and others are doing too in Canada to try to have that more serious, more engaging, and more useful conversation about housing.
This is, what Leilani and I have been on on the barricades around this for a long time, and it's in some way we talk about it as that we need to change the conversation. We need to change the language, how to talk about things. Leilani established very importantly that housing is a human right, which we now a lot of advocates are using. So that's one step further. It's not only a housing market, it's also housing is a human right. But then I was back in Toronto now in October, and that was then almost 5 years later than we premiered Push, and I could still hear this kind of exactly what you say. People are more into this kind of individual explanations of why things are. And that's a bit sad. And then so how do we change the conversation?
One of the ways that I see folks changing the conversation is through collective action. So right now in Toronto, we have more than 600 tenants on a rent strike. There are two different fronts. There's a total of 8 buildings involved, and they are just haven't been paying rent for now, some of the buildings now for 9 months. Others joined more recently. They're up against large and extremely powerful corporations. On one of the sites, the landlord is Starlight, but Starlight only acts as a set manager for PSP Investments, which in Canada is the pension fund of federal public servants. And some of the tenant organizers and one of those who got an eviction notice actually works for the federal service. So they have their pension plan trying to evict them from their houses because they refuse to pay a 11% rent increase over 2 years. On the other front, you have Dream Impact, which is the environmentally conscious, community-focused arm of the larger Dream Unlimited. Also pushing this thing in Canada we call above guideline rent increases. It's a loophole that allows landlords to increase rent by even more than the allowed guideline. And they are simply ignoring tenants. They're so powerful that this tenant union managed to, through a lot of political work, they managed to get the mayor involved. The mayor first sat with them behind the scenes, and then eventually decided to come public and invite Dream Impact to sit at the table and have a conversation and try to negotiate. And Dream Impact simply said, "No, thanks, we're not coming." So they're I think they are trying to change the conversation in a very concrete way. Really powerful action.
We told a story about the rent strike in Parkdale, a neighborhood of Toronto in Push, and they actually won the rent strike. But we remember also the nerves, all the eviction notice they got, all the aggression they had to receive. It's a very tough thing to put your own home at the line in a struggle. So it's not an easy thing. And I mean, I told here Leilani earlier that we had here in Malmo also, I think 3,000 tenants refusing to pay the rent increase, and in the end they also won. But maybe it was a short-term win because now they're pushing up the rents again. But we have a very different system here. But still, suddenly in countries that are not so revolutionary like Canada and Sweden, suddenly people are feeling the desperation that they have to kind of break the rules, which we are not so used to. Isn't it interesting, Leilani?
It's interesting. It's amazing what these 600 plus tenants are doing, not just because, of course, there's so much risk that they'll be evicted, but once evicted, if evicted, they know that they can't afford any other apartment in their community, even in the city maybe. And so they know that it could be a fast road down to who knows what, displacement, maybe even homelessness. And so the courage is tremendous, but also the conviction. They know, I mean, this is why I think it for me, why human rights works. I mean, insofar as that's what they're demanding. To me, they are demanding their right to live in a home with security that's affordable and, in decent condition. So, I mean, that is the human right, and they are defending it so strongly. I guess my question to Ricardo is this. We all know here on this podcast that change comes from the ground up, for sure. I mean, that when you look at, how change happens, it's from mobilizing, it's from people taking to the streets, it's from things like rent strikes. At the same time, there's a way in which there isn't a movement in Canada when you have this building over here and that building over there and the building in Vancouver, and they might even be the same owners, but the tenants aren't connected across the country. And so my question to you is, how effective can this be without more kind of mass mobilization and without demands? See, the demands for the rent strikers are to their specific landlord. Well, it may be, and please tell us, to governments. But do we need more? You've said in an article that we need to go more on the offensive. So what does that look like? What more do we need to really, you're suggesting we need to change the system. If you read the Tenant Class, that's what you're saying, right? The system is broken. The system is causing this. We need to change the system. So how do we get there?
Mm-hmm. What I think is particular to the Canadian context, which I haven't seen elsewhere. And elsewhere, I have in mind Brazil, which is where I grew up and where is my first My first book and my original academic work was focused on the history of participatory democracy and social movements in Brazil. So in comparison to that context in Brazil that I studied and that I lived in, what I find particular about Canada is this immense disconnect between grassroots social movements and the rest of civil society. We have this professionalized civil society, which I'm part of, that it's too willing to engage in formal mechanisms of consultation with government that accept in its entirety the framework set up by government, and it just waste, in my opinion, a huge amount of energy and time, and most importantly, resources. And on the other side, we have this grassroots movement going up against these immense corporations on their own with almost absolutely no funding, no support, nothing. They're just on their own. And so I agree with you that we would sort of have to connect both in order to have a more nationwide and a more effective movement. But right now it's not happening because on the ground, they have to deal with the repairs, they have to resist the evictions, they have to resist the rent hikes. And then on this other sphere, focus on just engaging with the government. So what I've been thinking a lot about recently and talking a lot about recently is how to move resources from one to the other. And then in that conversation, there's a particular question that we have to ask, which is, what is organized labor doing?
So I just want to put in one thing that I can see is, it's making everything more difficult, is that the progressive parties in the parliament are so hooked up with the homeowners. They are so afraid to lose the homeowners, so they do whatever they can not to shake that boat. And then in some way they are, the tenants are not so important. They're less important as a political class. This is something I'm talking from a Swedish perspective also. I mean, the Social Democrats are afraid of moving anything of the interest of the homeowners, which means that they have a lot of privileges that we, the tenants, don't have. And when the tenants are pushing, they don't really get listened to because it's like in this kind of political balance, we need to win an election. If we win, then we can help you, maybe, and then it doesn't really move because, of course, like the rent strikers, they would need to have somebody inside the political system that votes for them, that are really out there. I mean, I know there. Of course, there are some politicians coming down and meeting them and so on, but it's not a big thing.
Well, I mean, Ricardo knows more about this than I do in terms of policy and numbers, et cetera. But there's no doubt that policy making by different levels of government favors homeowners over tenants. 100%. They give money away to a private market to incentivize a private market that isn't producing anything that's actually needed, and that's really just benefiting, as Ricardo says, that a different class of people, the elites, the owners. And so, I mean, there is little doubt that governments curry favor with homeowners. They believe homeowners are their base, their voters, right? And in Canada, we have a particular situation, political situation now, where that narrative of who is supporting homeowners is right at the center of political debates as the more conservative party gains power and traction, using the idea that homeowners are being given a raw deal. And so you get the other parties reacting by saying, no, we really support homeowners, rather than anyone talking about tenants. And so there's little doubt, but I do wonder, and I asked this to Ricardo, I mean, we have cities like Toronto and Vancouver where tenants are becoming the majority. And do you think this will eventually, I mean, things are slow moving here, but will this have an impact on the politics?
It could, but it would take work. It would take political work on our part, because there is a growing share of the middle class, and we're talking about professionals, we're talking about households with 2 income earners, with above median incomes, for whom ownership is not in sight anymore. They grew up because of the socioeconomic context in which they grew up expecting that they would own a home, and now that's not possible anymore. And they're interested in talking about housing. And the question is, what kind of framing and in what kind of action are they going to get involved in? And that's where the political work comes in, because I think it's an opportunity for us to really radicalize them and not to allow them to follow into some apolitical, low L liberal framing of housing, or to be demanding forever governments to come through it and make the white picket fence dream possible for them, but to radicalize them in terms of the inequalities in the housing market, and to kind of bring them and the resources and the influence that they could bring along with them to the tenant movement. But that takes political work, and I think that's part of what we should be doing. And I was surprised that the book reached that crowd, because that's not who I had originally intended as an audience. I had thought about writing a resource for organizers and for tenants who are already active in the movement, but I felt like it also reached that crowd. And it was interesting, and it was an opportunity to have some conversations, to be in some spaces that I wouldn't have been otherwise. And again, try to really to radicalize them and bring them to the movement in a very sort of political and in a way willing to engage in an antagonizing way, which is really hard for Canadians.
Yeah, absolutely. You have a piece in your book where you say tenants are not homeowners in the waiting. And I love that. I mean, that's the narrative, right? That all tenants just want to be homeowners. And so there is a way in which if we could get tenants to speak up and, as you say, be antagonistic about, hey, wait, my dream is not necessarily home ownership. My dream is security and affordability where I'm living right now. That's my dream, right?
Yeah, that's something we forget about. People don't buy homes because they love to spend their Sundays fixing the basement, right? Like they buy homes because they want housing security. They want their kids to go to the same school throughout, JK to 12. And we have to kind of make that connection again and say, is home ownership the only way to achieve housing security? And it shouldn't be, and it doesn't need to be.
Just for our audience outside, you just tell me, because Canada is it's really bad in Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal. It seems, it's extreme. This is the only thing people are talking about. Leilani, Ricardo.
For me? Well, again, Ricardo probably knows the stats better, but Canada is one of the most expensive places to live on the planet, actually, in terms of rents in some of our cities. What's so disturbing is the unaffordability of housing is across the nation in cities big and small now. It's not just Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal. We're seeing it in the smallest of towns and middle-sized towns. I have a daughter, for example, who's in Halifax attending university, and she's looking for accommodation for her second year. And if she wants to live alone, I have yet to find an apartment below about 1,800 Canadian dollars per month for a single dwelling apartment. We know that the average, I think, Ricardo, I read recently that the average rent across Canada right now, and I don't know how many bedrooms, maybe this was considering all bedroom configuration, is $2,075 average rent.
What is that in euros, more or less, just to people?
Oh, I have no idea. 1,500 maybe? We'll have to do the calculation. But it's a lot, and I'll tell you, Ricardo, you know the data. If you're working, tell us about, if you're working minimum wage, where could you afford in Canada and what could you afford? A minimum wage job.
Yeah, pretty much nowhere. That's one of the studies we do at my center. We compare average rents with the minimum wage, and we have done this over time. And in the cities, small and large, renting takes more and more hours of work than it used to be. So it's this notion where capital is clearly double dipping on workers. So you're paying less, and then you pay low wages, and then the workers take that low wage home, and then the landlords, which were more and more some sort of merged corporation, there was also the corporation that they worked for, takes this big chunk of the hours back in the form of rent. And it's across cities, small, medium, and large in Canada right now.
Yeah, and the aggressiveness of some of these landlords in Canada. I mean, people always think of Canada, and Ricardo referred to it, we are polite, like too polite and all of this. But I'll tell you, some of our landlord businesses are not so polite. They're aggressive. And I mean, Starlight is one that Ricardo mentioned, but there are many more. And they what they do, in my opinion, is they exploit weak laws. So rather than saying, "Oh, these laws don't, are kind of weak. I'm just going to be gentle and play gently." What they do is they say, "Oh, these laws are weak, and I'm going to exploit that." So, for example, they apply for what we call above guideline rent increases. So in some provinces, there are actually rent caps, and landlords are, you have this in Europe too, Fredrik, where landlords can say, "Oh, well, I developed the property or I made some upgrades, and so therefore I should be able to raise the rent a little bit." And it's sometimes not a little bit. In the case of these rent strikes, it's like 10% over 2 years. Yeah. Meanwhile, people's incomes remain stagnant. So, or certainly not rising that amount. So really aggressive and resorting to renovations that make people's lives so uncomfortable they feel they have to leave the units, so noisy and disruptive, right down to, not renewing leases so that they can kick tenants out, the existing tenants out, and new tenants come in and they can raise the rents. So very, very exploitive.
So, my dear Canadian friends, I mean, Ricardo, you also have a Brazilian heart, but still, I can label you as Canadian and a friend. What are the demands? Where are we going? What are we telling? What are we painting on the streets and on the walls?
Some of the demands of the movement right now are pretty simple, actually. One of them is rent controls. In some provinces in Canada, rents can go up by however much the landlords feel like. And in the provinces that do have some form of rent increase cap, there are a lot of loopholes that are, as Leilani mentioned, used and abused. So that's one kind of pretty straightforward demand. The other demand that comes more from the kind of professional civil society is moving a larger share of the total stock out of the market, of the private market. Canada has one of the lowest shares of non-market housing compared to other countries. And then from the movements, more specifically, there is this conversation around demanding collective bargaining rights, similar to what labor unions have.
What we have in Sweden. Yeah,
exactly. I think, to my knowledge, is the only country where I have seen that, and that would be a game changer. We think it has come up every now and then throughout Canadian history for some time now, but it's not something that we have achieved. And to Leilani's point about how aggressive landlords can be, other than being aggressive in their business practice and in trying to maximize return, there's also now more and more documentation on their union busting strategies. They're very deliberate at not meeting with organized tenants. They have very clear strategies for demobilizing organized tenants. And with the rent strikes in Toronto, for example, that we just mentioned, there was a very concerted effort of a number of landlords involved not to give in and not to recognize unions as official interlocutors and pushing to always talk to tenants individually instead. So they know what we're trying to do, and they're trying to resist it very actively.
That's it. I mean, you recently made a podcast with Chris Smalls, the Amazon Labor Union president, and I mean he knows everything about union busting. That's maybe a charming thing that the people with money knows the power of organized labor, so they really want to fight back in time. But I think it's very important to highlight what they're doing, what tactics they're using. But we should go back to our demands. I mean, you say we need to move housing out of the market. Is that like social housing, what they call it in other countries, or?
Yes, we've now been using the term non-market housing to refer to various models of housing that is not for profit. So it could be co-op, it could be public housing that is attached to government and that attached to subsidies and ongoing programming. It could be non-market housing providers, not-for-profit housing providers, so like NGOs. There are different models in different places. Different things would be the best suited, and there's different expertise across the country and all of that. But in general is the notion of moving away from housing as a commodity and more as a public good or a right.
But Leilani, who is not a Marxist, what I know, you will still say that can't we have private owners and then make them perform better? Can we have capitalism that respects human rights and respects the planet? What do you think? Can we have that, Ricardo? A capitalist system that respects human rights and the planet?
I would love to see that. Yes. Me too. That's the trick, right? And then the question is, if it gets implemented, is it still capitalism? But we don't have to have that conversation. We can just say capitalism must be responsive to human rights and to environmental concerns, and whatever that looks like, it looks like. But it's an imperative.
Oxfam presented their inequality report now recently, and they coming with that. They also presented a number of millionaires and billionaires who wanted to pay more taxes. So it's not necessarily that because you're super rich that you want other people to suffer, So there are people who think, okay, I could pay more, and maybe then you could maybe also run a housing company with less profits, because it's the profits you're talking about, Ricardo. That the developers the margin of profits are extremely high. Is that something? This is something we don't really talk about, because they always say it's too expensive. We need to push up the rents. Here also over here, some of the housing companies are suffering now because the high interest rates. But I know also they were buying thousands of apartments with borrowed money. So of course they're under stress, but but these are the companies who've been sending profits to their owners for ages, So it's like and they want us to cover their stress that is created by them pumping up the values of our homes. It's totally fucked, I would say.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a good concept. No, but I think it brings us to the conversation of financialization, right? And at a very sort of simple and basic level, what financialization means is that we lost any concrete anchor of cost and profit, right? So conversations about rent right now in Canada and elsewhere is no longer about, this is how much, it costs to maintain this unit. This is how much it costs to purchase it. If rent is X, there's a 20% margin that is reasonable over time. No. It's always in terms of relative gains, right? So any landlord who make however much on one unit, they're looking literally across the street and saying that the unit is renting for more. And what they're thinking is the relative loss. They could be making more, so they have to push the rent. It's the so-called rent gap, right? They have to push the rent to that level because there's more to be made. And it never ends. There's never a ceiling to it because someone else pushes up and they want to push up and then there's push up.
And the market is not functioning in the other direction, never, of some reason.
No, no. And we talk about pension funds and their involvement in this as well, right? There is an argument that pension funds could be involved in rental housing. Because if you think about it, it could be a very low risk, fairly low return, long-term investment, which pension plans used to be very interested in. In Canada, we used to have even government bonds that were specifically designed for that purpose. But pension plans are now not involved in that way. They're just involved also in making things work and participating in with REITs and all of that.
You have a Swedish, basically Bahamas Cypriotic company called Akelius moving into Canada big time. They actually left Sweden and they left Germany where they were really big. But a lot of their money is coming from pension funds. And sometimes it's also union pension funds that they attract because they say, okay, but we can give you very good return on capital. Come on, this is fun. And then the people running these funds say, oh, I would be a big mistake if I don't put the money here, you know? I mean, this is something we raised in Push, and I know we've been talking to bank people about it and so on, but it's very hard to move this issue because everybody's first job is to bring back money of the investment.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think we have to do some better narrative building. And I really liked in one of your pieces, Ricardo, where you kind of said that civil society isn't doing its job well enough. You didn't say it quite like that. I mean, you said that we have to be more on the offensive, but I took it to heart, and I've been really looking at advocacy and my own advocacy, to be honest, really taking a good look at, okay, why are we not more effective? Because I think we're not being very effective, not just in Canada, across the globe. I now do a fair bit of work in Europe, and why are we not more effective? And I mean, I think we have to start bringing pension funds into a conversation about what harm looks like in the context of investment and what social value looks like in the context of investment. And the problem right now, believe it or not, is climate change isn't helping in terms of housing investment because, believe it or not, investment in housing is seen as a green investment as compared to oil and gas and the dirty resources. So it's like, whoa, wait a second. They're pivoting away from oil and gas to housing as an investment. I read a report about the prospect for investment in Europe over the next 5 years, and that they're saying the projections are more investment in residential accommodation because of this, the Green Deal and the push toward greener investments. I'm thinking, oh my gosh. So I really think we have narrative building to do, conversations to have, and somehow bringing up what's happening to tenants right in the faces of pension funds and other investors.
And people are super stressed, of course. I mean, in all our societies are now kind of breaking up because people are so stressed and so frustrated and afraid. But of course, also some of the homeowners are also stressed because they also made some bad business by buying at the wrong moment, and the interest rates are going up. So the stress is shared in some way, and some of them are also victims of the same kind of model, even if the people who bought in time are safer and so on.
Mm. Yeah, there is a lot of stress out there, and at least two wars happening that are having a direct impact on supply chains, etc., is no friend to tenants, unfortunately, right? I mean, because landlords just use that, investors use that as a reason. Oh, now it's more expensive for me to build. I'm going to pass that on to whoever is going to reside in the buildings that I'm building or that I'm renovating or retrofitting. We can't end here. We've got to end on a positive note, Fredrik. Take Ricardo.
To Leilani's point on the narrative, I think one thing that we don't do enough is to link the real estate industry to negative economic impacts in the rest of the economy. Is what is traditionally called a rentier sector, like it sucks money out of the system, right? So we focus a lot on low-income households who are struggling perhaps to meet their basic needs, but when they're not buying something, someone's not selling something, right? And also with the household debt that we have right now, the consumption power of the middle class has declined as a consequence. So it has a negative impact to other sectors of the economy. And that's what, in my media work, I've been trying to call that, to talk about that more and saying, you know, if people pay too much in rent, other economic sectors will not see that money.
And the growth of rent is not growth of economy. You know, it's like it's fake.
Non-productive.
It's non-productive. Yeah.
It's rent.
Yeah.
It's rent. It's what economists call rent.
Yeah.
But the other piece, I think, that kind of brings me a little bit to some of the reflections and reactions that I had watching Breaking Social is the political imaginary, right? We're bombarded with negative news and bombarded with this all together sort of daunting scenario, and we have a lot less access to stories of collective action. Our kids not learn enough about social movements and the history of popular movements and all on the history of struggle and resistance and so on and so forth. So I think there's a huge role for that to sharing more of those stories and to sharing more of the history in order to animate people and to show people that it is possible. Because again, back to Breaking Social, the notion that this is it and there is no alternative it's a classic austerity message from the right?
Yeah, and I think I'm really thank you for this little note. First of all, mentioning Breaking Social, that I'm happy that this film can be used in a conversation. And I when I meet the audience, I always constantly say that we need to transmit inspirational stories. We need to transmit stories of people fighting back. And this is like also what we try to do in this podcast. Stories of people doing cool stuff. And then again, also the message to everybody out there, if you feel that you don't have energy to do something yourself, try to support people who are doing something. If you see struggles that people are actually fighting back, try to support them, even if it's just with sweet words or support on social media. But try to be there, because you talked about how the union busting strategy is now used against tenants in Canada. So I mean, you can be very lonely to sit there and have an eviction order and you fight these extremely big entities. So solidarity and flowers and chocolate and love is like, it's actually something that helps, And we have here in Sweden now a very long ongoing strike against Tesla. It's been ongoing for, I think, three months. And Elon Musk don't want to have Swedish collective agreements, and the unions of the whole country is fighting. So I mean, but there are also a lot of people coming out with cookies and coffee to the union people standing outside the Tesla workshops. So solidarity can be fun and beautiful, and I think that's kind of a good wrapping message, isn't it, Leilani?
Especially right now when so many people across the world are protesting, in particular about what's happening in Gaza, but about many other things as well. Yeah. And I can tell you, as someone who is very engaged right now in protesting, a little love goes a long way. The other thing I will say, I notice, and I'll end my comments here, I've noticed some people would like to protest, would like to be part of a movement of one sort or another, but are a little bit afraid or don't know what's going to happen if they do it. And I've noticed that certainly. I walk with a group of people. We walk our dogs together, and I've been educating them about what's happening in Gaza. And a few of them have said they would like to go to a protest, but they're afraid. What if there's violence, or what if they get a ticket, because people here are being ticketed for free expression. And so it's really interesting to me. So we have to encourage people and support and say, hey, come to the protest with me. I'll make sure you're safe.
That's a sweet thing. Ricardo, amazing to have you on our podcast, and congrats to your important book. I mean, you created a tool for people who want to fight back, and that's what I think we should do with books and films and so on. We should give people tools and help to change the conversation, and that's what we're doing with this podcast.
Thank you for having me. And my nerdy note that I'm going to end on, it's a historical one, is that if we just look at organized labor and the collective action that workers have carried out throughout history and in many parts of the world, we have achieved so much. It's not perfect, for sure, and there's a lot more work to do, and sometimes institutionalized labor has its flaws. But if we look back the kinds of rights and the kinds of achievements we have had, it's quite inspiring. And nothing says that we cannot have the same in housing.
We can. Yes, we can.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. And I hope you get the springtime coming soon, all of us. And not only springtime in the climate, but also in fighting back, pushing back. Thank you very much, and have a great day over there.
Ciao.
Ciao. Thanks.
Thanks.
Pushback Talks is produced by WG Film. To support the podcast, become a patron by going to patreon.com/pushbacktalks. Follow us on social media at make_the_shift and push_the_film. Or check out our websites, maketheshift.org, pushthefilm.com, or breakingsocialfilm.com.